Welcome to the Supported Living Property Podcast with your host, me, Lisa Brown, the place to learn about supported living property investing. Hi, Robert. It's great to have you here today. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you, Lisa.
Good. Now, I've wanted to have you on the podcast for a while because you've got so much experience to share. So I think it's going to be really interesting hearing your experiences and hearing what you've got to share with us. Do you want to tell people a little bit about you and explain your background for us?
Yeah, sure. My name's Robert Mellors. I run a company called Choice Housing Limited. It's a not-for-profit company limited by guarantee. So it works on pretty much the same lines as a charity, but we're not actually allowed to register as a charity because we don't have a board of trustees. But it's still a not-for-profit organisation in the same sort of way. Where it also falls into the category of a housing association, but we're not a registered social landlord or registered provider of social housing, as they call it now. We are what's called an unregistered housing association. I've been doing this since 2004. Immediately prior to that, I'd been working in the voluntary sector, citizens advice, doing things like benefit claims, employment tribunals, benefit tribunals, homelessness applications, and things like that. So a whole range of things, but at a caseworker level. And I thought that kind of fed into the realms of providing support to people. I'd also experienced homelessness myself back in 1996, 97 sort of time, and indeed a couple of times since. So I went from working at Citizens Advice Bureau and a day centre for the homeless in Worcester, and from that I started work in local authorities doing short-term contracts as a homelessness officer, and so that kind of pushed me further into the realms of helping homeless people. And based on all of those experiences, my own experience of homelessness, dealing with the benefit system and helping others to deal with the benefit system, and then working in local authority, so I could see the local authority perspective of how they deal with homelessness. I thought, well, there's a number of people that fall in all the gaps. So they can't access social housing and they can't access private rented housing because they don't fit the criteria for either. And they are the sort of people that need lots of additional support to obtain and sustain a tenancy of their own. And that's what I set out to do. So in 2004, I set up my housing association. Did it all wrong, of course. It was the wrong legal status, wrong documentation, all that sort of thing. So it was a not-for-profit organisation, but it was not a company limited by guarantee, which it should have been. So over in 2015, I had to get all that changed and start afresh with the legal status side of things. Along the way, I've made pretty much every mistake you can think of, but hopefully learned a lot from it, and gradually moved more and more towards supported housing rather than family lets, and shared supported housing as opposed to single self-contained flats. And that's where I am at the moment, really.
Was that a very big jump from being someone who was delivering support within the local authority or within the voluntary sector to then setting up your own organisation? Did you find that was a big jump, or did it feel very natural step?
Well, initially I did the setting up my own housing association, and running that was very much a part-time role. So I ran that at the same time as working in local authorities, and had to liaise with the local authorities to make sure there was no conflict of
Of
interest.
course. Yeah.
So it was a gradual build-up of my own company, that over a long period of time. So the first 12 years of running the housing association, I didn't receive any salary or anything. I did it all free, but it was part-time, and I was employed alongside that, or I was on benefits myself for a period of time, as a lone parent. So I was bringing up my daughter. So it's kind of gradually moved from being a part-time role with just a few properties to building that up and deciding that that's what I'm going to do as my full-time position.
And how many people are you supporting now, Robert?
We have 37 rooms in 10 properties, all in Sheffield. And then we've also got a couple of properties outside of Sheffield, but we don't run those as supported housing. Those are just your normal general needs housing. So we do provide support to the residents of those properties, but more on a ad hoc basis rather than a regular basis.
And so you mentioned you'd sort of moved towards that shared housing model. That's the way that you're delivering most of your support now. Is that right?
Yeah, so in 2010 we started the shared housing in Sheffield, and initially it was just done as straightforward HMO accommodation, not as supported accommodation. But I found that the type of residents we were getting, we needed to provide support into those properties more and more, not only to manage the properties, but to improve the lot of the people that were there. They might have struggled with different aspects, and so we started building up the level of support and making it more regular. And we now provide weekly visiting support to all our residents. So far we've housed and supported over 650 people.
Wow, that's so impressive, isn't it?
And provided over 185,000 nights of accommodation.
Wow. They're really
So
impressive statistics, aren't they?
it's fantastic, because the type of residents that we are accommodating are the ones that may have lost their accommodation at other hostels, or the local authority has no legal duty to house them. So without us being there, these are the people that you would see in the shop doorways, and sleeping rough, or in tents, or in a squat somewhere. And we provide that accommodation and the support to help stabilize their situation and start turning it around. So we give the opportunities.
Now, I'm sure there's no such thing as a typical person who's living in your properties, but the sort of some of the stories or some of the sort of backgrounds of people who, who come to you, where would they have come from, or where would they have been previously?
We get quite a few from other hostels and housing associations. We get some that have had relationship breakdowns with their partner and found themselves homeless. We've got people coming out of prison or other like bail hostels, that sort of thing. We have some that are coming out of other supported accommodation, which might be more specialised, such as um, uh, drug dependency accommodation, and they've lapsed on
Hmm.
their, and they've resumed their drug use, so they can no longer stay in the abstinence-based accommodation.
Hmm.
Um, we have some coming through social services and NHS and a whole range of things. We did compile some statistics a couple of years back, and we found that 83% have suffer mental health problems.
Yeah.
I think we're about 65% have some offending history. There's about 50% have alcohol abuse issues. We've got about 60% have drug use issues, lots of multiple debts, and quite a high level of domestic violence and childhood sexual abuse situations as well.
They
Uh,
all overlap, sadly, don't they? All of
yeah,
those. Yeah.
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 So most of our residents end up with multiple complex needs that all, fit together.
Mm.
So they can't deal with their debts because they have got mental health issues and drug dependency issues.
Mm.
They can't deal with the drug dependency because they've got mental health issues, and that masks the mental health issues and things. So one thing's linked to another. So you have to start by, it's a bit like the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You've got to provide the basics, a safe environment, a roof over your head, some heat and some support, and then you start building up on the other skills, which then enable the person to deal with the issues that have caused their homelessness or continue to keep them homeless.
Mm. And typically, how long are people with you? I'm sure there's a big variation, but do you have a kind of average length of stay, or does it really, really vary?
Well, it's a very big question. There's people that will be with us for many years, and there's others that will just stop for 2 or 3 months. The average length of time is about 10.5 months, which is a higher period of time than people usually stay in hostel accommodation. But it's um, that will include um, both the success stories and those that
Mm.
aren't.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, not everyone kind of can stick with the supported housing.
No. Oh, you're talking about people with some very complex needs there, aren't you? Really, such a, and a multifaceted needs as well. So yeah.
Yes, and there's very little um, because we provide visiting support rather than uh, on-site staffing.
Mm.
Um, Sometimes there might be a mismatch between the level of support that we can provide and what the person actually needs. And sometimes it's not even the level of support, it might be supervision that they need, or to prevent um, their own visitors taking advantage of them. Um, there can be situations where people are subject to financial exploitation by their so-called friends. Um, and if you haven't got on-site staffing, then that's more difficult to um, control
Mm.
and make sure that the residents not being a victim to that.
obviously, we talk about property a lot here as well, and obviously property, like you said, is the foundation stone, isn't it, really, for the support that you're delivering. What kind of properties are you typically using? Do you use a range of different properties, or have you got sort of one that you prefer, you find fits really well with your model?
We do use a wide range of different properties. So we have anything from, like a 2-bedroom flat, for example, through to sort of 6-bedroom house with 3 reception rooms and things. So we don't tend to go for blocks of flats. We don't tend to go for very large HMOs. We find that the dispersed model seems to work better. And ideally, we would have something like a 3-bedroom semi-detached house would be ideal for us, because they tend to be set back from the road a little. You've only got one immediate neighbour that you're adjoining to. You've got some back garden space, without it being too much. And then you've got some decent sized rooms that you can offer to the residents. If you can get 2 bathrooms in, fantastic. If you can get another reception room in, that's great. But essentially, you can use a lounge as one of the letting rooms, so you can have a choice of 3 or 4 people residing in that property, with shared facilities.
I know that you speak to a lot of landlords and a lot of property investors. People approach you and with properties or with the option to buy properties for you. Talk about some of the experiences you've had with landlords and how you found that. Because obviously you've got good ones that you work with, and I see you smiling there for those who are on the podcast. But what kind of experiences have you had?
I think generally we've had a whole range of them. The ones that we've had, which we no longer deal with, are the ones that don't care about their properties. And they want to use the cheapest cowboy out there to do anything. And
Mhm.
we end up picking up all the pieces, and it just doesn't work very well. When you're talking about our client group, we need things to be strong and robust and
Cool.
hard wearing. So
Mm,
we tend to do the adaptations ourselves. We tend to know what works for us and our particular client group, and that
mm,
might be very different to what would work for a different client group.
mm.
So where we've have really good relationships with landlords is where they're sensible about the rent they want to charge.
Now I
They
can hear
want,
landlords going sensible. What does that mean? I know what I think. They're thinking, sitting
yeah.
here thinking, I know what I think sensible. It might not be what Robert thinks is sensible. So, what do you mean by that?
It has to work for both of us. Yeah, it's no good trying to charge us twice as much as the local housing allowance rate for that size property, um, on the basis that, oh, you can use it for supported housing. We can use any property for supported housing, um, so long as it's not in a particular area or got restrictions on it and things. So trying to overcharge simply because they're trying to market it to supported housing providers is not the way to go. I think the way they need to look at it is, if they were going to let a property to a private tenant, what is the return that they would get? So they'd look at the market value, the market rent for the property, work out what the voids would likely to be, what renovations they'd need to put in during those void periods, how much they might need to pay an agent, how much hassle they're going to get from having to arrange minor repairs and deal with the tenants directly, and then work that out over the lease term. So we offer a 6-year lease. So over a 6-year period, how much of that would they get? How much hassle? How does it work out as the rent? And then look at what we would be offering over that same period of time. And of course, by leasing their property to a supported living provider, such as ourselves, they don't have all those costs. They don't have those risks. They don't have the hassle of evicting someone. They don't have to worry about whether they're working or unemployed. They don't have to worry about whether they're paying the rent, cost of living crisis, anything like that. Whether the person's having children in the property, and that's going to mean there's less money to spend on the rent. All of those concerns that would affect a normal private landlord are taken away.
Yeah.
We take all the risks, maybe not all the risks. We
take a lot of them
eliminate
away.
99% of the risks to the private landlord.
Yeah, and certainly,
And
I
that's got to
know I
be
say
worth
this
something.
a lot, but having properties let on the private rental sector and properties let on to supported living providers, or even though I've got really good managing agents in place on my private rented properties, I still get phone calls. I still get, oh, this has happened. Do you want us to fix it or not? Do you want us to find here are 3 quotes for you to compare, or here's this, or here's that? It takes a lot more work than the phone call from my supported living providers saying, oh, this has happened, Lisa, just to let you know, but we're getting it all sorted. I know which phone calls I prefer.
Yeah. I mean, most of the time where we've been leasing from a private landlord, they are very much hands off, and they're welcome to come and have a look at the properties and things like that. There's no issues with that, but they renew the lease with us again and again.
And that says everything, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, there's not enough of them.
Well,
We need
hopefully
some more
people listening
landlords
to
with
this.
properties in Sheffield to get in touch with us. But the ones we do have seem to be very happy with what we're offering them. And I think that says a lot that they renew their leases with us and are happy to do so, even though they know they can go down the road and go to the local estate agent, and the estate agent will say, well, we'll give you 200-300 pound a month more than what Robert does. Yeah. But
But
they
it's
know
looking at
the
that big
value of
picture.
what we're offering. And
Yeah.
that's important. I find that a lot of landlords or property developers, property investors that haven't been in this market don't really understand the value that we bring to that arrangement. And it really is, we give people peace of mind, and that's priceless.
It is. It's really, I think, I know I say it a lot, but, letting a property to a good supported living provider is, really does. It is, I think, one of the best ways to hold property for the long term. It's, it's very, very powerful. What would you say to the providers listening who are setting out, who are saying, I'm just about to start having conversations with landlords. I'm a bit nervous about what to say. I don't quite know how I will have these conversations with them. From all the experience that you've had and all the conversations that you have had, would you say, was there any advice you'd give people?
Be totally honest. Be very upfront and open about what it is you're offering, what you're offering differs from letting to a large organization or letting to via an estate agent or letting agent. Be very clear about whose responsibility different things are. So a lot of people don't ask the awkward questions. They might not want to offend the other party. And so, they think everything's going to go well. They've been sold the dream. And yes, it might do, but what happens if things don't go to plan? And those are the questions you need to be asking. You need to ask, well, what happens if housing benefit stops? What happens if the tenant trashes the house? Who's responsible for the fire doors that the residents kick off the hinges? You know, what happens if there's a water leak? What happens about the boiler servicing? You know, you need to ask all these questions and be satisfied with the answers you're getting. And that works both ways. The providers need to be really, really clear about answering those questions, but the landlords need to be willing and able to ask the questions. They need to be able to think of the questions and ask them. Because if they don't ask them, then when that situation arises, that's when there's conflict, because it's not clear who's responsible for what.
And that's what worries me about a lot of people jumping into this space from a property point of view, is everyone's jumping in going, oh, this looks great, brilliant, shiny new thing, let me do supported living. And then they don't know what they don't know. They don't know the questions they don't know to ask. And so they're jumping in, and then suddenly I get all these messages in my inbox going, oh, this has gone wrong. It's not all been perfect.
Well, this is leads you into kind of the rent-to-rent situation, because the more people you've got in that chain, the more difficult it becomes to answer those questions. So if I'm there as a supported living provider and there's a rent-to-rent operator, and I ask them, well, what happens when the roof tiles come off? They would have to then say, well, that's not really something I deal with. I would have to go back to the owner, and it would be the owner's responsibility. But then I say, well, okay, what if the owner says, stuff you, I'm not going to replace those roof tiles? That leaves me and my tenants with no roof covering.
Yeah.
Who's going to fix it? The middleman, the rent-to-rent, is not going to want to pay out to do that.
No.
The owner's refusing to, and I've got no direct contractual relationship with them, so I can't hold them to doing it. Who's going to pay for those roof tiles to be fixed? And this is, the more people you have in between you and the owner, the more difficult it becomes to answer those type of questions. But those are vital questions. That's just a very
It's really
simple
important.
example.
Yeah,
But
it's so important for any providers listening to be really, really switched on to this rent-to-rent model. And for anyone who's listening who's not familiar with it, it's where someone owns a property, they rent that property to a rent-to-rent operator, whatever you want to call them. They rent the property for a period of time, and then they sublet that property to a provider, say like you, Robert. So you, as you said, there's a middle person in the middle there of that relationship, and contractually as a provider, who is your relationship with, and where does that leave you exposed? And you really, really need to be careful with that, don't you?
yes.
Yeah.
And of course, the other thing is with private landlords is you also need the terms in that require them to have the permissions from higher authorities. So that might be their mortgage lender,
Definitely.
might need the permissions for that, could be their insurance company.
Yeah.
But also, if it's a flat, they might have a freeholder involved as well. And you need the arrangement to be such that you've got it in writing that they've received those permissions from those other authorities to enter into that lease agreement.
It's so important as a provider you understand as well the property side of things, and you get your head around it, so you understand all of these things, so that you do make sure you're not taking risks. As I said, again, I get approached by a lot of providers who've jumped into signing leases on properties, or rent ASTs even on some properties, not even leases, and not understanding all of those complexities, and then things go wrong, and they're left exposed again. It's there's a lot to this, to getting it right, isn't there? Like you said, you've been doing this for 20 years now, and I bet you've learned masses in that time, There is a lot to get right and a lot to get wrong in here, isn't there, really?
There is,
Yeah.
and it can be quite scary seeing some of the ads on social media for people that are, I don't know, they're currently working as a social worker and they're going to set up a supported living house, and it's like,
Mm.
do you really know what you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, it's
It's
why I
not
set
that
up.
straightforward.
No, it isn't. I
Uh,
mean, it's why I set up the training I did for providers, because there's so much to it. And I got fed up of speaking to providers like in that situation, really genuine people with a really great background in, in care or social work, or, then they're just getting stung by the property side of things because it
oh
is so,
yeah.
yeah.
I mean, the heart's in the right place, and they're trying to get things done
Mm,
in the right place, and ensure that they're providing to the client group that they have a particular interest in
mm,
providing to. But it doesn't always work out that way, and there's that many risks involved in that transition from one type of provision to going into supported housing. So it's not for the faint-hearted. And certainly when I hear people saying, "Oh, well, I'm going to set up as a registered provider," I think, "Oh no." Read the information, because there's that much to it.
yeah.
And most people haven't done the due diligence to find out what's involved in that process.
Yeah, it's very complicated becoming a registered provider of social housing, isn't it? It's really, really complex, and they're not making it easy at the moment at all for people to become registered.
You know,
No.
and I mean, even going into the supported housing side of things, the legislation is changing.
Mm.
There's that many things that are changing at the moment. You've got the uh, Supported Housing Regulatory
Very-
Oversight Act
I wish they could call it
2023.
something a bit snappier. It'd be much better, wouldn't it? Yeah.
It certainly would. Obviously, that doesn't affect supported housings directly at the moment, supported housing providers. But what it does do is it affects local authorities and puts duties on local authorities, which will then have the knock-on effect of affecting supported living providers.
Yeah, that's
Um,
definitely going to have big impacts on providers all over the country, isn't it? And I think a lot of people aren't prepared for those changes.
yeah, and of course we've also got the national statement of expectations, and I think anyone looking at going into um, or setting up as a supported housing provider needs to read and understand that document,
Yeah, definitely.
because
We'll
it's
put the link in the show notes to it again. So if people haven't seen it, I'll make sure that's in there as well.
right.
Uh,
I think
because
that kind of gives an indication of where we're heading to, where it's going, and
mm,
it's heading to more and more regulation,
yeah,
basically.
yeah.
Some might
Rightly
say
so,
that's
because
needed, but it also ties your hands a bit and makes things less flexible, and that flexibility might be needed as well.
yeah, yeah, it's very difficult, isn't it? It's needed to crack down on some of the bad operators in the sector, but then it becomes, like you say, a little bit more challenging for people who are doing a good job to be able to deliver things in the way they want to. So yeah,
Yes.
it's I think it's going to be an interesting few years, isn't it, with all of this coming in to see all the changes that happen. Robert, thank you so much for coming in and sharing your experience. It's been really, really helpful, and I'm sure people really value what you've shared with us. So thank you.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.
No problem.